On June 12, 1967, in Washington, D.C., the Loving v. Virginia Supreme Court case overturned anti-miscegenation laws. The tragedy of separating interracial couples led to the banning of all anti-interracial marriage laws in the United States. Loving v. Virginia would be seen as a triumph against traditional marriages, obliterating old standards of courtship. Interracial couples were common all over the United States, but because their marriage were not legal, many would hide it. Hayes v. Alabama was one of the earliest miscegenation cases recorded and was the first to reach the highest court. In 1883, Tony Hayes, a black man, and Mary Jane Cox, a white woman, wanted to marry. But due to Alabama's law not allowing a colored person and a white person to marry, they did not marry. Tony Hayes and Mary Jane Cox took their case to the Supreme Court, hoping that it would be overturned. Lamentably, the court ruled in favor with Alabama's original ruling. Decades later, the Racial Integrity Act was introduced on February 1, 1924, in Virginia. Virginia banned marriages between white and colored people in order to prevent racial intermixing. Although this prevention came into place, many Virginians filed cases claiming that they had the rights of marriage. Around 1950 and 1960, there was a movement called the Civil Rights Movement. It was a time when both white people and people of color fought for social rights and equality. Richard Loving, a white man, and Mildred Jeter, a black woman, grew up together as childhood friends. Racial discrimination was not rare, but despite the racial differences, the two families lived near each other as peaceful neighbors in Virginia. Gradually, Richard and Mildred's friendship would be more than that. They eventually fell in love. With the permission of both parents, the two decided to marry elsewhere, knowing that interracial marriage interfered with the marriage laws of Virginia state. In order to marry, the couple decided to exchange marriage vows at Washington, D.C. on June 1958, since interracial marriage was legal in that area. After getting married, they returned to Virginia only to be arrested 5 weeks later. The newly wedded couple were arrested in the morning while they were still in bed. Felony charges were pressed on them because they violated Virginia's anti-miscegenation law. The Lovings were given two options. Either they serve a year in jail or accept a plea deal, meaning that the couple would have to leave the state and return no longer married to each other within a range of 25 years. Although they peacefully left, they still wanted to legally live with each other in their own hometown. In June 1963, Mildred Loving wrote a letter to U.S. Attorney Robert Kennedy in hopes of Kennedy helping the Lovings return to Virginia legally. Kennedy referred the matter to the D.C. branch of the ACLU. ACLU, otherwise known as American Civil Liberties Union, is a society that specializes in preserving the rights of all individuals across the United States. The ACLU sent two lawyers, Bernard Cohen and Philip Hirschkopf, to represent them in a case against Virginia. The lawyers desperately tried to persuade the judge to vacate the Lovings' conviction, but the judge refused. Judge Leon Bazell upheld the original ruling, stating that the punishments were imposed on both parties, making the ruling justly. Determined to stay together no matter what, Richard Loving and Mildred Jeter sent the case to the Supreme Court. On June 12, 1967, the U.S. Supreme Court case, Loving v. Virginia, was held between the defendant of Virginia's local state court and the plaintiffs Richard and Mildred Loving in Washington, D.C. The Lovings fought for their interracial marriage, which is forbidden under the laws of Virginia state. Philip Hirschkopf and Bernard Cohen, members of ACLU, were fighting against Virginia state court. Under the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, All citizens are under all equal protection of the laws. States are not able to deprive someone of their life, liberty, or property without any due process of the law. The two ACLU members meant that violating someone of their personal and marriage rights contradicts with what the 14th Amendment states, that all citizens cannot be deprived of their life and are all under equal protection. McGuane was Attorney General for Virginia and was a representative of the court. Robert F. McGuane stated that Virginia's anti-miscegenation laws did not violate the 14th Amendment, and that even if it did, the laws prevented the state from sociological and psychological evils which is present in interracial marriages. Bernard and Philip Hirschgott both argued that it was indeed unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment. The general attorneys also argued that not allowing a couple to marry simply because of the difference in skin color was based on slavery laws and racism, which was self-evident. After the arguments were heard, the court reviewed the 14th Amendment of the Constitution and came to agreement. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled that Virginia's anti-miscegenation laws were in fact unconstitutional, and in the end, not only were Virginia's anti-miscegenation laws abolished, but also any laws throughout the United States similar to those of Virginia's. On June 12, 1967, anti-miscegenation laws were abolished in every state. Abolishing anti-miscegenation laws dealt a blow against segregation between people of color and white people. After banning all anti-miscegenation laws in the United States, there was an increase in interracial marriage, which shows that the Lovings case was proven to be effective. For example, shortly after the case, an interracial couple married on August 13, 1967. Richard and Mildred Loving and their family went back to living the way they did like any other family. Subsequently, the Lovings, along with relatives, faced outcasting and open opposition. The two avoided publicity and lived quietly, continuing to raise their 3 children. Triumphing through it all, Richard and Mildred Loving could finally live in Virginia with their extended families as a married couple. Sadly, a couple years later, the Lovings were hit by a drunk driver. Mildred survived, but suffered from injuries, while Richard, on the other hand, regrettably died from the crash on June 29, 1975. Before interracial marriage was ever legal, most marriages were usually traditional, meaning it was between a man and a woman who were the same race. After the decision that people of different races and color were allowed to marry, there was a widespread of interracial couples all across the country. Although there is still a high number of traditional marriages, interracial marriage is not very uncommon, since nearly 1 in 6 newlyweds have spouses of a different race. The Lovings case was also used as a base for arguments during many cases, specifically cases that revolved further marriage rights. For example, Loving versus Virginia was briefly mentioned in the Obergefell versus Hodges case, which took place on June 26, 2015. During the case, Justice Anthony Kennedy briefly mentioned the Loving versus Virginia case when he was speaking for the legalization of same-sex marriage. After casting the votes of all the 9 justices, there were 5 justices for legalizing gay marriage and 4 against legalizing gay marriage. This voting caused the legalization of gay marriage in the United States. Before this case, there were many gay couples before it was legalized, but after the outcome of the case, couples were able to get married according to the law. Loving versus Virginia redefined America's view of what marriage can be. Throughout history, society has made marriage exclusively traditional, only between a man and a woman of the same race. Legalizing interracial marriage led to the increase of many interracial couples, and it was no longer seen as an uncommon thing. Not only did Loving versus Virginia lead to interracial marriages, but allowed other types of marriages to form, such as same-sex marriage.